The dust of Hestia's landing tasted of rust and failure, a fine red powder that coated the tongue and settled deep in the lungs. It was the planet's last gift to its conquerors, a slow, patient poison. From her cramped observatory, perched on the lip of the great strip mine that had devoured a continent, Dr. Eris Thorne could watch the consortium's bulk freighters burn their way into orbit. Lumbering metal ticks fattening themselves on the world's iron-rich blood. They never hailed, they never acknowledged, they simply took. Below, in the warren of prefabricated habitats that passed for a city, her people moved with the slow, shuffling gait of the perpetually tired, their faces smudged with the same red dust, their eyes fixed on the cracked pavement as if afraid the sky itself might demand a toll. For 50 years, since the consortium had absorbed the outer colonies in the name of economic stability, this had been the way of things. Humanity wasn't a slave race, not officially. They were debtors. Their ancestral voyage to the stars leveraged into an unbreakable cycle of servitude. The consortium provided life support, recycled water, and nutrient paste, and in return, Hestia's landing provided ore. The ledgers were always just out of balance, the debt always just beyond their reach, a careful, calculated form of damnation. Eris hated it with a cold, quiet fury that she channeled into her work. A fury that lived in the hum of her illegal power conduits and the flicker of her shielded monitors. Her work was the colony's only secret, its only sin. A seed of hope cultivated in the absolute dark. They called it the 0-point module. The consortium, in its rigid understanding of physics, believed the vacuum of space was empty. They were wrong. It was a roiling ocean of quantum foam, a well of infinite potential energy, and Eris, standing on the shoulders of forgotten earthbound giants, had built a key to open it. Her sanctuary was a hollowed-out asteroid in the planet's Trojan orbit, a ghost rock they called the Kiln, a skeleton crew of true believers, the last engineers and physicists who remembered what human ingenuity felt like, toiled there in secret. They had built a ship, if one could call it that. It had no name, no weapons, no crew comforts. It was simply a frame, a cockpit, and a heart the ZPM core, a polished black sphere that seemed to drink the light around it. The vessel, which the crew had nicknamed the Nyx, was not a weapon. Eris had been adamant it was to be a proof of concept, an arc. With a functioning ZPE drive, they could generate limitless energy, revitalizing the colony's failing infrastructure. More than that, they could leave, not with a roar of defiance, but with a whisper, slipping between the folds of space-time to find a new home, a place where the sky was their own. That was the dream. But dreams were a luxury on Hestia's landing, and the waking world was about to come crashing in. The catalyst arrived in the form of Auditor Kalen, a man whose face seemed assembled from sharp angles and condescending smiles. He was consortium middle management, a predator who enjoyed the petty cruelties of his post. He descended with an escort of chrome-plated security frames, their blank visors reflecting the colonists' fearful faces. He announced a new tithe, a 50% increase in ore production, effective immediately. The reason given was a market fluctuation, a lie so blatant it was an insult. The truth was that a new war front had opened with the silicates in the Perseus arm, and the consortium's war machine needed metal. Hestia's landing was simply the nearest, most compliant source. The colony's administrator, an old man named Jian, who had the weariness of a century etched into his skin, tried to protest. He spoke of failing equipment, of radiation sickness, of the simple fact that the planet was nearly bled dry. Kalen listened with theatrical patience before having one of his security frames break Jian's arm. The snap echoed in the sudden silence of the plaza. "The consortium's ledgers are not subject to negotiation," Kalen stated, his voice calm, almost bored. "Fulfill your quotas, or we will begin liquidating assets, starting with your medical supplies." That night, the colony simmered. Eris watched from her window as whispers turned to arguments, arguments to shouts. Desperation was afire, and Kalen had just thrown oil on it. A young hothead named Reese, a miner whose father had died from a tunnel collapse the consortium had deemed an acceptable loss, decided he'd had enough. He and a handful of friends sabotaged the primary mag lift, the colossal rail system that carried ore from the pit to the orbital loading platform. It was a foolish, symbolic gesture, a child's scream against a hurricane. But the hurricane noticed. Kalen designated the act as insurrection. He sealed the colony, cut off all off-world communication, and declared martial law. His security frames, no longer just escorts, became an occupying army. They patrolled the corridors in squads of 5, their heavy footfalls a constant, metallic heartbeat of dread. Curfews were imposed. Rations were cut. Public floggings began for minor infractions. Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, where this was going. The consortium had a standard playbook for non-compliant assets. They would make an example. They would break them utterly, then install a new, more compliant administration over the survivors. She tried to warn the others, to plead for calm, but Reese's act had lit a spark in the people. Resistance cells formed overnight, armed with mining tools and salvaged parts. They were brave, and they were going to be slaughtered. The first shots were fired 3 days later. A resistance group tried to ambush a security patrol and were cut down by pulse fire in seconds. In response, Kalen ordered the first pacification. He chose a residential block at random and had his ship, the Iron Hand, level it from orbit. The beam was a silent, surgical line of light from the sky. And when it vanished, a city block and 500 people had been turned to superheated glass and ash. That was when the dream of a peaceful escape died, in the kiln, hovering in the cold silence of space. Eris watched the replay on a grainy feed, her face a mask of horror. Her hands were shaking. All her life, she had believed in the purity of knowledge, that science was a light that would guide humanity out of the darkness. But the light could also be used to aim a weapon. Around her, the faces of her crew were grim, set like stone. Elias, her lead engineer, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands, turned to her. "They won't stop. Eris, they'll scour the planet to make a point." He was right. The orbital strike was just the beginning. Kalen would dissect the colony, piece by piece, until the resistance was carved out. There would be no survivors. Only a cautionary tale whispered in other exploited systems. "What do you want me to do, Elias?" she asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "Use this, use the Nix. It's not ready. The spatial displacement field is unstable. We've never tested it with a living crew." Elias's gaze didn't waver. "And the people in Block 7 weren't ready to be turned into glass. We're out of options. We run, or we die." The decision felt like a betrayal of every principle she held. a violation of her own soul. This beautiful, terrible engine she had created was about to become a weapon, not by design, but by necessity. She looked at the ZPM core, its blackness no longer seeming like a promise of infinity, but an abyss. With a slow, deliberate nod, she gave the order. Power it up. Get everyone from the colony who can make it here. We're getting out. The evacuation was a chaotic, desperate scramble. Using hidden tunnels and service conduits, hundreds of colonists made their way to a secret launch bay, packing onto repurposed mining shuttles. They were terrified, but the sight of the iron hand hanging in the sky like a steel god was a more immediate terror. Eris and her core team were on the bridge of the Nyx, a room that was less a command center and more a laboratory. Wires were still uncapped, panels still open. She strapped herself into the pilot's chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the controls. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the low, resonant hum of the ZPM. They've detected the shuttle launches, Elias called out from the sensor station. The Iron Hand is powering main cannons. We have maybe 2 minutes. Iris took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting thin and metallic. Get the shuttles behind us. Route all primary power to the displacement drive. Forget safety protocols. Elias, just give me everything. The hum of the core deepened, vibrating through the deck plates, a sound that felt older than stars. On the main viewer, she could see the Iron Hand and its 2 smaller escort frigates maneuvering into a classic killbox formation. They were expecting a conventional ship, something they could swat from the sky with casual ease. They had no idea what they were facing. Drive is charged, Elias said, his voice strained. Field cohesion is fluctuating. Eris, this is going to be rough. Just get us out, she whispered, her eyes locked on the targeting computer. She wasn't aiming at the ships. She was aiming at a point in empty space 1,000 kilometers beyond them. She wasn't firing a missile. She was punching a hole in the universe. She engaged the drive. There was no lurch of acceleration, no roar of engines. For a single, terrifying second, there was nothing. The lights on the bridge flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The inertial dampeners failed, and a crushing weight slammed Eris into her seat. The ZPM's hum became a deafening shriek that wasn't sound, but a pressure inside her skull. And then came the light. Outside the viewport, reality tore open. It wasn't an explosion. It was an uncreation. A wound of impossible geometry appeared in the void. A swirling vortex of non-colors and broken physics. Space itself folded in on itself, pulling the consortium ships with it. The Iron Hand didn't blow apart. It stretched. It's sleek. Powerful lines elongating like taffy. Its hull plates peeling away into ribbons of light and static. The 2 frigates wobbled, distorted, their forms seeming to flicker in and out of existence before being swallowed by the rift. There was no sound, only a profound, sickening sense of violation, as if they had witnessed a god having a seizure. The rift sealed itself as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a distorted star field and an echo of warped gravity that made the Nyx's sensors scream. And then they were through. The stars on the viewer snapped back into their proper places. But they were wrong. The constellations were alien. The nebulae unfamiliar. They had jumped, not just across space, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere far from home. The lights on the bridge flickered back on, revealing a scene of quiet devastation. Elias was slumped over his console, bleeding from his nose. Others were stirring, groaning. Eris felt a trickle of warmth on her own cheek and realized it was blood. She looked at the empty space where the consortium fleet had been, at the ghost readings of their last moments. She had saved her people. She had done it. But as she stared into the new, unknown darkness, a cold dread washed over her. She hadn't built an ark. She had built a monster, and she had just shown it to the galaxy. The silence that followed was worse than the scream. It was a dead, flat quiet, the kind that comes after a lightning strike, when the world holds its breath, waiting for the thunder. On the bridge of the Nyx, the only sound was the frantic hiss of a ruptured coolant line and the low, pained groan of Elias trying to push himself upright. Eris's head throbbed in time with the ship's emergency strobes, which cast the scene in stark flashes of red. The air tasted of ozone and blood. "Status," she managed, her voice a raw croak. Her console was a mess of error warnings, a waterfall of amber and crimson text. Elias wiped a smear of blood from his lips with the back of his hand. We're alive. I think main power is offline, running on battery. Life support is stable. The ZPM is dormant. It's cold. Eris. Like it was never even on." He tapped at his console, his movements slow and pained. "The shuttles are still with us. All 6 accounted for. They're dark, probably running on minimum power to avoid detection, but their locator beacons are active. We didn't lose anyone in the jump." A wave of dizzying relief washed over Eris, so potent it almost buckled her knees. They hadn't lost anyone. But the relief was swiftly chased by a chilling aftershock of memory, the image of the iron hand stretching, dissolving, its crew of hundreds erased from existence in a heartbeat. They were murderers. Survivors. Yes, but murderers all the same. "Where are we?" she asked, forcing the image from her mind. Elias shook his head, pointing a trembling finger at the forward viewer. "Nowhere I've ever seen. Star charts are useless. We're off the map. Completely." Eris unstrapped herself and moved to the viewport, her legs unsteady. The star field was magnificent and terrifying, a tapestry of unfamiliar constellations burning with a cold, fierce light. There was no consortium shipping lane, no familiar nebula, no Hestia. There was only the Nyx, her 6 dependent shuttles, and 1,000 souls adrift in an ocean of alien stars. The true cost of their escape began to reveal itself over the next few hours. The shuttles, designed for short-range mining runs, were dangerously overcrowded. Their life support systems were straining, their food and water reserves finite. Worse was the sickness. A message came from the medical shuttle, a frantic plea from a woman named Lena, the colony's chief medic. People were experiencing violent seizures, hallucinations, and severe temporal disorientation. They were calling it jump shock. Eris patched a comm link through to the shuttle, her face appearing on Lena's flickering monitor. The medic looked exhausted, her scrubs stained with something dark, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "It's the rift, isn't it?" Lena asked, her voice tight, cutting straight through any pretense. Whatever that thing did, it left a mark on them. Eris nodded grimly. "The displacement field. It's not just moving through space. It's tearing it. The human mind isn't meant to witness that. We were shielded on the bridge, but the shuttles." Lena's expression hardened. "They're scared. Aris. Some are saying you've damned us all. That we traded a quick death for a slow one out here in the dark. Are you one of them? Aris asked, her own guilt a heavy weight in her chest. Lena was silent for a moment, the sounds of suffering a faint backdrop to her transmission. I'm a doctor. I see 500 people suffering from something I can't treat. But I also see another 500 who are alive because of you. Damnation is a luxury we can't afford. What we need is a destination. Give them a place to stand, and I can start trying to put them back together. The medic's pragmatism was a splash of cold water, a necessary shock to Aris's system. She was right. Wallowing in guilt was an indulgence. She was the leader now, the architect of their terrible, miraculous salvation. And she had a duty to see it through. I'll find us a home. Lena, she promised. Just keep them alive. Finding that home was a race against time. The Nyx's long-range sensors were damaged, but a passive scan of the system revealed a miracle, a terrestrial world in the habitable zone of a binary star system. It was a tidally locked planet, one side in perpetual twilight, the other in eternal night, orbiting a stable red dwarf and its smaller, white companion. They called it Tenebris. It was their only hope. Meanwhile, halfway across the galaxy, in the empty stretch of space where Hestia's landing used to orbit, another ship had arrived. It was a consortium vessel, but it bore no resemblance to the brutish angles of the Iron Hand. This was the Inquisitor, a long-range scout ship, sleek and black as obsidian, designed not for battle but for discovery. And it carried Prefect Valerius. Where Auditor Kalen had been a blunt instrument of corporate policy, Valerius was a scalpel. He was a man of quiet intensity, with pale gray eyes that seemed to see not just what was there, but the spaces in between. He stood on the bridge of the Inquisitor, observing the void where an entire battle group had simply ceased to be. His subordinates presented their findings with nervous deference. No debris. Prefect. No wreckage. No bodies. No radiation signature consistent with an antimatter explosion. It's as if they were deleted. Valerius listened, his hands clasped behind his back. He had read the reports on the Hestia insurrection, a minor asset, a trivial uprising. Kalen was supposed to have handled it. But this was not the work of miners with homemade explosives. He walked to the ship's primary sensor array, a holographic projection of the local space-time continuum. To the untrained eye, it was a smooth, black grid, but Valerius saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible scar. There, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Magnify this sector. The technicians obeyed. The grid zoomed in, and the scar became more apparent. It was a residual distortion, a pucker in the fabric of reality, leaking trace amounts of exotic particles his sensors couldn't even classify. It was like the ghost of a wound. They didn't use a weapon, Valerius mused, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in his eyes. A weapon destroys. This is something else. They opened a door and pulled 3 consortium warships through it. He turned to his astrogation officer. Analyze the decay signature of these particles. I want to know where that door led. Run every theoretical FTL model we have, even the forbidden ones. I want to know who these desperate little miners are, and I want to know what kind of god they've built for themselves in the dark. The journey to Tenebris was agonizing. 3 more people died from jump shock, their minds unable to reconcile the brief, terrible glimpse of unreality. When they finally broke atmosphere, descending through layers of violet and crimson cloud, the sight of a solid world below was enough to make people weep. They landed the shuttles in a vast, petrified forest, where ancient trees, black as charcoal, stood in silent congregation under the perpetual twilight of the binary suns. The air was thin but breathable, rich with an alien, earthy scent. For the first time in 50 years, they stood on land that wasn't owned by the consortium, under a sky that wasn't watched by their ships. It was a moment of profound, fragile hope. Aris was the last one to leave the Nyx. She stood in the engineering bay, her hand resting on the cold, silent shell of the 0-point module. It was inert now, a simple sphere of polished black alloy. But she could feel the power sleeping within it, a coiled serpent of infinite energy and cosmic violence. Elias found her there. "We're setting up a perimeter," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They're crying. Eris. I haven't seen anyone cry from happiness in decades." Eris didn't turn. "How many did we lose?" "3 to the jump shock," Elias said quietly. "Another 2 from injuries sustained during the chaos. 5 lives. Eris. In exchange for 1,000. "And the crew of the Iron Hand?" she asked, the question a bitter taste in her mouth. Elias put a heavy hand on her shoulder. "That was Kalen's choice. He could have let us go. He chose to open fire. You chose to save our people. That's the only ledger that matters now." She finally looked at him, and he could see the war raging in her eyes. "This isn't over, Elias. The consortium, they don't just write off a debt. They will hunt us. That thing we did, it was loud. Louder than any explosion. They'll find the echo." Elias squeezed her shoulder. "Then let them come. We're not scared miners on a dust ball anymore. We're free, and we have the monster on our side." Eris looked back at the ZPM, its smooth surface reflecting her own tired, haunted face. A monster. Maybe he was right, but she was its keeper, and the thought terrified her more than the consortium ever could, as the twin sons of Tenebris cast long or skeletal shadows through the petrified forest. The survivors of Hestia's landing began the arduous task of building a new world. They were free. But they were also marked. Far away, following a trail of decaying quantum echoes. The Inquisitor adjusted its course. Prefect Valerius stood watching the shifting star charts, his expression calm and patient. The hunt had begun. He was not just following a ship, he was following a scientific impossibility, a new variable in the galactic equation. And Valerius, above all else, could not tolerate an unsolved equation. The first year on Tenebris was a crucible. The petrified forest, which they named the Ashenwood, provided shelter but little sustenance. The planet's biology was silicon-based, its flora crystalline and inedible, its fauna creatures of chitin and mineral armor that scurried between the black, fossilized trunks. Survival depended on the hydroponics bays they salvaged from the shuttles, a fragile green lifeline in a world of gray and violet. Every day was a struggle against the planet's alien indifference and the ghosts they had brought with them. The jump shock had left deep scars. Many survivors suffered from chronic migraines and a persistent, unnerving sense of déjà vu. Others whispered of seeing things in the long twilight, flickering after images of the rift, a tear in their perception that refused to heal. They were a traumatized people, haunted by their violent birth into freedom. Paris bore the heaviest burden. She was their leader, their savior, their monster tamer. Every decision, from water rationing to the layout of their fledgling settlement, fell to her. She worked relentlessly, driven by a desperate need to build something that would justify the lives lost, both theirs and the consortium's. She poured her energy into restarting the Nyx's ZPM, not as a weapon, but as the heart of their new world. The power it could provide would mean limitless heat, light, and energy for their hydroponics, a final, definitive victory over the scarcity that had defined their existence. But the ZPM remained silent. The jump had drained it completely. And more alarmingly, the process that had brought it to life in the controlled environment of the kiln refused to work here. The quantum foam of this new sector of space was different, calmer, less volatile. The key she had built no longer fit the lock. Her failures in the engineering bay of the Nyx were a quiet, personal agony. To the rest of the colony, she was a pillar of strength. To herself, in the cold hum of the dormant core, she was a fraud who had made a one-time deal with a devil she couldn't summon again. Reese, the young miner whose act of sabotage had triggered the catastrophe on Hestia, became her shadow and her conscience. The jump had changed him. The hot-headed boy was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful man who saw the cost of his youthful anger in the haunted eyes of his people. He led the survey teams, mapping the strange, silent world around their settlement, which they called Haven. He was the first to discover the Caves of Light, a network of subterranean caverns where bioluminescent fungi cast an ethereal blue glow on vast, underground lakes. It was a source of fresh water, a discovery that secured their immediate future. But Reese also saw the fractures forming in their small society. A faction, led by a former pit foreman named Marcus, began to voice dissent. They saw the dormant Nyx not as a symbol of hope, but as a monument to Eris's gamble. They argued for pragmatism, for stripping the ship for parts, for abandoning the dream of high technology, and learning to live off the land, however harsh. "We're not scientists anymore," Marcus argued in a heated council meeting. "We're farmers with broken tools. That ship is a reminder of a power we can't control, a power that got us into this mess." Eris countered with desperate logic, pleading for patience, for faith in the science that had saved them. But her arguments rang hollow, even to her own ears. As long as the ZPM remained inert, the division grew, a subtle poison seeping into the foundations of Haven. Meanwhile, Prefect Valerius was methodically closing the distance. The quantum trail had led the Inquisitor into uncharted territory, a silent, empty quarter of the galaxy the consortium had deemed unworthy of exploration. Here, there were no hyperlanes, no comm relays, no familiar beacons. There was only the hunt. Valerius was a patient predator. He didn't rush. He collected data. He found the system where the Nyx had made its first uncontrolled jump. He found the scorched remains of a small asteroid where a hidden shipyard had once been the kiln. He recovered fragmented data logs, schematics, research notes. He began to understand. This wasn't a stolen piece of consortium tech. This was something new, born of desperation and genius. He began to feel a strange, unsettling respect for his quarry, this unknown architect of a new physics. He learned her name from a corrupted personnel file, Dr. Eris Thorne. He read her theoretical papers, illegally published on dissident networks, and saw in them a mind that was both brilliant and, in his view, dangerously unrestrained. She had broken the fundamental laws of the universe not for power or conquest, but simply to escape. It was an act of such audacious, elegant defiance that it fascinated him. He reported his findings to his superiors, carefully editing his language. He described the event as a novel energy weapon, the fugitives as highly dangerous technological terrorists. He omitted his growing suspicion that what Aris Thorn had unleashed was not a weapon at all, but a fundamental reordering of what was possible. He needed to be the one to understand it, to control it, before the consortium's blunt, militaristic hierarchy tried to simply destroy it. Back on Tenebris, Aris had a breakthrough, not in the lab, but in the world outside. Following a hunch from Reese about strange magnetic readings in the Ashenwood, she led a small team deep into the petrified forest. They found it at the heart of a valley where the air itself seemed to hum with a low energy. It was a tree, or what had once been a tree, far larger than the others, its trunk a sheer cliff of black, fossilized wood, but embedded in it, like veins of captured lightning, were fissures of a crystalline substance that pulsed with a soft, internal light. Her tricorder chirped wildly. The crystal was a naturally occurring superconductor, resonating at a quantum frequency she had only ever seen in her simulations. It was the missing piece, a natural catalyst that could amplify the ZPM's initiation sequence, allowing it to draw power from this calmer, more stable vacuum. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through her for the first time in months. They could do it. They could bring the Nyx back to life. But as her team began the delicate process of extracting a sample, a tremor shook the ground. It wasn't seismic. It was deeper, more fundamental, far above them, in the violet sky. A silver sliver appeared, a star that wasn't a star. It grew, resolving into the sleek, predatory shape of the Inquisitor as it descended from orbit. Panic erupted in Haven. The sight of a consortium ship, the boogeyman from their past, sent a wave of collective terror through the settlement. Marcus and his faction saw it as the final proof of Aris's folly. "She led them right to us," he roared in the central plaza. Her magic box was a beacon, not a shield. Elias, trying to maintain order, found himself facing a desperate, angry mob. He sent a frantic, coded message to Aris's comm unit. "They're here. The settlement is tearing itself apart. Get back now." Aris watched the ship descend, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had been right. The echo of their escape had been heard, but this wasn't a warship. It was a scout, smaller, more refined. That was somehow worse. This wasn't a hammer blow. It was the arrival of the dissector. "Leave the crystal," she ordered her team, her voice tight with adrenaline. "Get back to Haven. Tell Elias to prepare the shuttles for evacuation. Scatter protocol. Get everyone to the caves. Go." As her team scrambled back toward the settlement, Aris stood her ground, her gaze locked on the descending ship. This was her responsibility. She had built the door, and the man coming through it was coming for her. The Inquisitor didn't land with a roar of engines, but with a whisper of anti-gravity drives. It settled in a clearing a kilometer away from her position, its silence more menacing than any threat. A single figure emerged, walking toward her across the alien landscape. He wore the severe, gray uniform of a consortium prefect, unadorned and practical. He moved with a calm, deliberate confidence, as if he were merely stepping into a laboratory to observe a new specimen. He stopped 10 meters from her, his gray eyes scanning her face, the humming tree, the abandoned mining equipment. There was no weapon in his hand. He didn't need one. His presence was a weapon in itself. "Dr. Aris Thorne," he said, his voice calm and resonant, carrying easily in the thin air. It was not a question. "I am Prefect Valerius. I have come a very long way to meet the woman who broke reality." Eris's mind raced. He knew her name. He knew what she had done. This wasn't a pacification mission. This was an inquest. "You're a long way from consortium space, Prefect," she said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "Trespassing, I believe." A faint smile touched Valerius's lips. "Consortium space is wherever its interests lie, and you, Doctor, have become a very significant interest. An anomaly. My purpose is to understand anomalies, to categorize them, and, if necessary, to contain them." He gestured to the humming tree behind her. "Like this. A naturally occurring zero-point resonator. Fascinating. You were trying to restart your device, weren't you?" His perception was terrifying. He wasn't just observing, he was deducing, connecting the pieces with frightening speed. "What do you want?" Aris demanded. "The same thing you want, Doctor," Valerius said, his voice softening with an almost professorial patience. "To understand the power you've unleashed. You've stumbled upon the next chapter of physics, and you're trying to read it in the dark. I am offering you a lamp." He took a step closer. "Surrender the device. Come with me. I can give you resources, laboratories, a purpose beyond mere survival. Together, we can map this new frontier. Your people will be relocated, cared for, return to a productive life within the consortium." It was a tempting lie, a gilded cage offered with a silver tongue. But Eris saw the truth in the cold calculus of his eyes. Her people would be reabsorbed, their memory of freedom erased. She would become a tool, her genius turned to building bigger, better rift engines for the consortium's wars. "My answer is no," she said. Valerius's smile faded. "A pity. I had hoped you would be reasonable." He raised his hand to his ear, tapping a comm link. "The asset is uncooperative. Initiate containment protocol, Gamma. Secure the device. And the settlement. Erase it. No witnesses." High above, the Inquisitor's weapon ports slid open. In the distance, in Haven, the first screams began as chrome security frames, deployed from a hidden dropship, marched into the plaza, their pulse rifles raised. Eris had a single, heart-stopping moment of despair. She had led her people to freedom only to deliver them into the hands of a far more intelligent, far more dangerous monster than Kalen had ever been. But then she looked at the humming tree, at the raw, untamed power resonating in its crystalline heart. She hadn't finished her work. The ZPM was still cold, but maybe, just maybe, she didn't need the ship to break reality one more time. The first pulse rifle discharges from Haven echoed through the ashen wood. Sharp, vicious cracks that sliced through the twilight stillness. Each one was a punctuation mark at the end of a life. Eris could picture it with sickening clarity, the chrome frames advancing, the people of Hoven scattering, Marcus's angry defiance turning to terror, Elias trying to rally a defense with scavenged mining tools. They were being slaughtered, and it was her fault. Valerius watched her, his expression one of mild disappointment, as if a promising experiment had just gone awry. "You see, Doctor," he said, his voice laced with a condescending pity, "this is the consequence of sentiment. You could have saved your own genius. Instead, you've condemned it, along with everyone you sought to protect. Desperation, cold and absolute," clarified Aris's thoughts. She looked at the giant, fossilized tree, at the pulsating crystal veins, and then at the mining equipment. Her team had abandoned a high-energy geological laser, a power conduit, and a portable resonance scanner. It wasn't a lab, but it was a circuit. Valerius saw the shift in her eyes, the flicker of calculation that replaced her despair. A line of concern creased his brow. "Whatever you're thinking, Doctor, stop. There is no escape. My men are securing your device as we speak. This world, and everything on it, now belongs to the consortium." He didn't understand. He thought the power was in the ZPM, the polished black sphere on the Nix. He saw the technology, the hardware. He didn't see the source. The power wasn't in the engine. It was in the void itself. The ZPM was just a key. And right here, in this humming, resonating tree, she had found another one. "You're wrong, Prefect," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "You don't own the storm. You just own one of the lightning rods." With a surge of adrenaline, she sprinted toward the equipment. Valerius, for the first time, looked alarmed. He shouted a command into his comm. "Subdue her. Do not damage the specimen." Two security frames that had been flanking him, almost invisible against the black trees, sprang into motion, their metallic limbs churning through the alien soil. But Aris had a head start. She slammed her hand down on the activation panel of the geological laser, a heavy-duty beam drill designed to crack asteroids. It wasn't a weapon, but it was a conduit for a massive amount of energy. She didn't aim it at Valerius. She aimed it at the heart of the great tree. The security frames were closing in, their pulse rifles whining as they charged. Aris grabbed the loose power conduit and jammed it against the laser's focusing array, then slammed the other end against the largest of the crystal veins in the tree. She was bypassing every safety regulator, creating a raw, uncontrolled feedback loop. The resonance scanner on the ground shrieked, its needle instantly redlining. The air crackled, and the smell of ozone, sharp and clean, filled the valley. The crystal in the tree flared, its soft, internal glow erupting into a blinding white light. A low hum, the sound she had felt in the valley floor, rose in pitch to a deafening, soul-shaking drone. It was the sound of reality's skin being stretched thin. Valerius had stopped, his clinical composure finally shattered by a raw, primal awe. He was witnessing physics being written on the fly, a process that should have taken a generation of scientists and a continent-sized particle accelerator, performed by one woman with a rock drill and a power cable. The two security frames, caught in the expanding energy field, simply ceased to be. They didn't explode. They dissolved into a fine gray mist of constituent atoms, their pulse rifles clattering uselessly to the ground. The ground beneath Aris's feet began to vibrate violently. The entire valley had become a capacitor, and the tree was the arc point. She had to let it go. She had to shape the release. She remembered the rift, the impossible, sickening geometry of the first jump. She had opened it by targeting a point in space. This time, she wasn't targeting space. She was targeting the Inquisitor. She screamed, a raw, wordless cry of fury and grief, and poured all of her focus, all of her intent, into that single, hateful point in the sky. The tree exploded, not with fire and thunder, but with a silent, outward blast of pure spatial distortion. A wave of shimmering, transparent energy erupted from the valley, moving at the speed of thought. High above, the Inquisitor was just beginning its orbital bombardment of Haven when the wave hit. The ship's advanced energy shields, designed to repel plasma, lasers, and kinetic rounds, were utterly useless. The distortion wave wasn't energy, it was a command to the universe to be different. The sleek, black vessel buckled, its forward section compressed as if it had hit an invisible wall, while its stern stretched backward, twisting at an impossible angle. Lights flickered across its hull like dying synapses. Then, with a final, silent spasm, the ship folded in on itself, becoming a dense, glittering ball of scrap metal no larger than a shuttle, which then plummeted from the sky, trailing a plume of black smoke. In Haven, the slaughter stopped. The remaining security frames, their command link to the ship severed, froze mid-stride. Their blank visors reflected the falling star of their crushed vessel. A stunned, ragged cheer rose from the survivors. They didn't know how, but they were alive. In the valley, the feedback loop collapsed. The light from the shattered tree faded. The hum died, and an unnatural silence fell. Aris was thrown backward by the final pulse, her body slamming into the hard, alien soil. Her vision swam. The last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the figure of Prefect Valerius, standing untouched amidst the chaos, his face a mask of incandescent fury, and something else, something that looked terrifyingly like enlightenment. When she awoke, she was in the cool, blue-lit darkness of the caves of light. Lena was leaning over her, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead. "Easy," the medic said softly. "You've been out for a day. You have a concussion and what looks like a case of severe radiation burn, but you're alive." Eris sat up, her head pounding. "The settlement, the people. We lost 23, Lena said, her voice heavy. Elias was one of them. He died defending the hydroponics bay. But the rest, you saved them. Eris, you saved us all. Again." The news of Elias's death was a physical blow, a pain sharper than any of her injuries. He had been her rock, her friend. Now he was gone. Another ghost to add to her collection. The security frames deactivated. We rounded them up. Reese is taking a team to the crash site of the consortium ship. He wants to see what we can salvage. And Valerius, Eris asked, dreading the answer. Lena's expression darkened. Gone. When Reese's team got to the valley, he was gone. So was the dropship that deployed his soldiers. He just left. That was the most terrifying news of all. A man like Kalen would have died with his ship, a martyr to corporate pride. But Valerius was a survivor. He had witnessed a second miracle, a second impossibility, and he had escaped with that knowledge intact. He wasn't just an enemy anymore. He was an apostle. He would go back to the consortium, not with a story of failure, but with a gospel of a new and terrible power. He wouldn't just send a fleet. He would start a crusade. A week later, Reese returned from the crash site, his face grim. The Inquisitor was a total loss, a compacted knot of hyper-advanced technology they could spend a decade trying to understand. But they had found the ship's black box, its central data core. It was heavily damaged, But Eris, working with a feverish intensity, managed to decrypt a fragment of Valerius's personal logs. The final entry was chilling. It was recorded in the moments after she had lost consciousness. The video showed Valerius standing in the ruined valley, his face illuminated by the burning wreckage of his ship in the sky. He was not panicked. He was not angry. He was transfixed. "The equation is not balanced," he whispered, his voice filled with a rapturous intellectual hunger. "She is not merely a variable. She is the operator. Control of the device is irrelevant. She is the device. The source is biological. The potential is limitless. Objective changed. Containment is insufficient. The new objective is acquisition. I will not fail again." Eris switched off the log, her blood running cold. He understood. He knew the power wasn't just in the physics. It was in her, in the unique wiring of a human mind pushed to the absolute breaking point, able to impose its will on the fabric of the quantum foam. She was the weapon. The knowledge settled on her, not with the weight of pride, but of a terminal diagnosis. She looked at the faces of her counsel Reese, Lena, and a few others who had survived. They were looking to her for a plan, for the next step. "He'll be back," Reese said, stating the obvious. "And he'll bring more than one ship next time." "He won't just bring ships," Eris said, her voice hollow. "He'll bring scientists. He'll bring tools to dissect me, to replicate what I can do. We can't fight a fleet, and we can't hide from a man who can read the echoes of our existence in the fabric of space." A heavy silence filled the cave. Their miraculous world, their hard-won sanctuary, had become a trap. Lena finally broke the quiet. "So what do we do? We can't run. The Nyx is still dead. That tree was our only chance to restart it. And you blew it to hell." Eris looked down at her hands. She could still feel the phantom energy coursing through them, the memory of the universe bending to her will. She had thought of it as a weapon of last resort. But Valerius had shown her the truth. In a universe run by the Consortium, a power like hers could never be a shield. It could only ever be a sword. "No," Eris said, a new, hard certainty in her voice. She looked up, and the grief and fear in her eyes had been replaced by something colder, something as unyielding as the void itself. "We don't run, and we don't hide." She stood and walked toward the cave entrance, looking out at the perpetual twilight of her broken paradise. "We've been the prey for too long. Valerius is hunting a monster. It's time he found one." The years that followed were a long, quiet war fought on two fronts. The first was on Tenebris, a battle for the soul of Haven. Aris, driven by Valerius's final, chilling message, began a transformation that frightened the very people she sought to protect. She was no longer just their leader, she was their weapon, and she spent her days honing its edge. She had Reese's team scour the planet for more of the resonant crystal, and she found it in trace amounts, veins of captured energy deep within the planet's crust. In a secluded cave, far from the settlement, she built a new laboratory, a place of dangerous, solitary work. She learned to touch the void, not with the raw, untamed fury of her grief, but with focus and precision. She learned to create small, controlled distortions, pockets of warped space no larger than her hand, and to seal them again. Each attempt left her drained, her body racked with pain and a psychic exhaustion that felt like a piece of her soul was being scraped away. The power demanded a price, and she paid it without complaint, her features growing sharper, her eyes colder, the warmth of the scientist slowly being replaced by the chilling focus of the Sentinel. The people of Haven watched this change with a mixture of awe and fear. They were safe. Their settlement was growing. The salvage consortium tech from the Inquisitor had accelerated their progress by decades. But the woman who had led them from the dust of Hestia was becoming a stranger, a figure of myth whispered about by the children she had saved, a lonely goddess in a mountain cave who kept the sky from falling. The second front was fought in the cold, silent depths of space. Prefect Valerius had returned to the consortium not as a failure, but as a prophet. He presented the wreckage of his own ship and the data from the Hestia event not as a military defeat, but as the discovery of a new Genesis, a power that would make the consortium's dominance absolute. He spoke of a biological source, a human singularity named Eris Thorn, who could command the fabric of reality with her will. He was met with skepticism, then intrigue, and finally with the full, terrifying weight of the consortium's resources. They gave him a fleet, not of warships, but of rolling laboratories and containment vessels. They gave him a new flagship, the Arbiter, a vessel designed for a single purpose, to be the perfect cage. For 5 years, he prepared. He didn't rush. He studied the data. He ran simulations. He developed weapons designed not to kill Eris, but to nullify her, to dampen the very quantum field from which she drew her power. He was coming back for his specimen, and this time he would be prepared for the God in the Machine. The sky broke on the 5th anniversary of their arrival on Tenebris. It wasn't one ship, but a dozen, appearing in orbit with a silent, coordinated perfection. They didn't descend. They didn't hail. They formed a blockade, a crown of thorns around Eris's world. Then came the message, broadcast on an open channel. Valerius's calm, resonant voice echoing through every speaker in Haven. Dr. Thorn, your isolation is over. I have returned not to punish your people, but to offer them a choice. Surrender yourself to my custody, and they will be granted a peaceful, productive reintegration into the consortium. Resist, and I will be forced to deconstruct your world, piece by piece, until I find you. You have one standard day to decide. Eris stood on the cliffs overlooking Haven, listening to his voice echo from the settlement below. She could feel his fleet in orbit, a weight on the very fabric of space, a pressure against her senses. Among them, she could feel the Arbiter, a cold, dead spot in the void, radiating a subtle dampening field that made her teeth ache. He was ready for her. A council was held in the caves of light, the air thick with panic. Marcus, now a respected elder, argued for her surrender. She can't fight a fleet. We'll all die for her pride. But Reese, his face set like stone, stood by her. She's the only reason we are free. We do not hand her over like a piece of property. Lena, the doctor, looked only at Ares. What do you want to do? Ares felt the eyes of 1,000 souls on her. They were asking her to perform another miracle, to once again save them from the consequences of her own existence. She looked at their faces, etched with fear and hope, and she finally understood what she had to do. The monster had to give them a final, lasting peace. Tell him I accept his terms, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I will surrender myself on the bridge of my ship, the Nyx, alone. The deal was struck. The Nyx, which had sat dormant and silent for 5 years, was designated as neutral ground. Valerius, taking no chances, landed the Arbiter a kilometer away and approached the silent vessel with a full escort of his new elite guards, their armor generating a localized version of the nullification field. As Eris walked through the empty corridors of the ship that had been their ark, she felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The bridge was dark, powdered with 5 years of fine dust. She stood before the command chair, her hand resting on its cold armrest, and waited. Valerius entered, flanked by 2 guards, his gray eyes sweeping across the derelict bridge. He looked at her, and a real, genuine smile of intellectual triumph touched his lips. It seems the equation has solved itself after all. Doctor, I'm pleased you chose reason. I chose to save my people, Eris corrected, her voice flat. Let them go, Valerius. Take me. Take the science. But leave them this world. Valerius walked slowly around the bridge, his gaze falling upon the centerpiece of the room, the polished black sphere of the 0-point module. Oh, I intend to. They are a triviality. You, however, you are the future. Once my science teams understand how your consciousness interacts with the quantum foam, we will replicate it. We will have an army of pilots who can fold space at will. The consortium will not just rule the galaxy. It will become the galaxy. He stopped before her, his smile fading, replaced by the cold look of the collector pinning a new specimen to his board. The age of ships is over, Doctor. The age of will has begun, and your will belongs to me. As he spoke, his guards raised their weapons, rifles that didn't fire bolts of plasma, but projected cones of shimmering, distorted air, the nullification field. Eris felt a crushing pressure, a psychic static that tried to sever her connection to the void. It was agony, but as the field enveloped her, she looked not at Valerius, but at the ZPM behind him. You're right about one thing, Prefect, she said through gritted teeth, her body trembling with the strain. The equation has changed. You spent 5 years studying how to stop me from breaking your reality. You never considered I might build a new one. She closed her eyes and reached out, not to the space around the ship, but inward, to the dormant, silent heart of the 0-point module. She couldn't power it on. She didn't need to. She had spent 5 years learning to be a key. Now, she would use the ZPM as the lock. She poured every last ounce of her will, her pain, her grief for Elias, her love for her people, her furious, desperate hope, not into the crystal of the tree, but into the perfect, artificial geometry of the core. The ZPM did not activate. It resonated. It became a focusing lens, an amplifier for the biological engine that was Eris Thorn. The nullification field from the guard's weapons flickered and died as the ZPM pulsed once, a wave of deep, silent bass that was felt rather than heard. Valerius's composure finally broke. He stared at the humming sphere, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. "What are you doing?" he stammered. On the bridge's main viewer, the stars began to move, but they weren't streaking as if in hyperspace. They were curdling. The entire planet of Tenebris was being surrounded by a shimmering, iridescent bubble of distorted spacetime. From Valerius's fleet in orbit, it was a sight of cosmic horror. The planet below them was simply enclosing itself. The bubble solidified, its surface like a perfect, dark mirror reflecting a star field that no longer matched the one around it. They were cut off. They fired their weapons, unleashing the full power of a consortium fleet. But the beams splashed harmlessly against the barrier, absorbed without a ripple. On the bridge, Valerius watched the alien star field on the viewer stabilize. He turned to Eris, who was now bathed in the soft, black glow of the ZPM. Her form was becoming translucent, her physical body slowly dissolving into pure energy. "You've trapped us," he whispered, his voice cracking with the horror of a zealot seeing his god become his devil. "I've freed them," Eris's voice replied, no longer coming from her mouth, but from the very air of the bridge. "You wanted a cage, Prefect. Now you have one. You are a master of a universe of one world, and you will never leave. You can study this anomaly for the rest of your life." Her physical form faded completely, the last of her energy absorbed into the ZPM, which now pulsed with a steady, living rhythm. She was gone, and she was everywhere. Valerius was left alone on the bridge of the dead ship, in a new, silent universe. Forever denied his prize. His obsession had granted him his wish. He had eternity to study his equation. But he was now trapped inside of it. On the surface of Tenebris, the people of Haven looked up at the sky. The familiar stars were gone, replaced by a new, a beautiful, and utterly alien celestial tapestry. The consortium fleet was gone. They were alone. Truly, finally alone. Reese and Lena stood on the cliffs, looking up at their new sky, and they understood the final, terrible sacrifice Eris had made for them. She had not built them an ark to sail the stars. She had become the sea itself, an endless, silent ocean of distorted reality that would protect them forever. They were free, and in the heart of the dormant ship that had brought them there, a new star, black and silent, kept its eternal watch